Sure. So I'm Bill Gardner, and on Bioshock, I was the lead level designer. And so I had my hands in all kinds of different things, helping Ken manage a lot of the design. But then on top of that, for most of the development, I was in charge of Welcome to Rapture, the first level, the Medical Pavilion, and Fort Frolic. And then towards about the last 6 or 8 months or so, I started to overlook a little bit more and more, work more closely with Ken to make sure the whole project was coming up to speed and getting where it needs to be. And so at that point, I handed those levels off and just focused on a lot more high-level stuff as I became more of a lead. And that meant, making sure that every system was represented in every single level, making sure that we have, equal representation and distribution for things like plasmids and Eve and all that sort of stuff. Make sure the resources were balanced, and working with Dorian Hart on balance stuff, and working with Paul on various systems and that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a fun process.
Son.
So Bioshock, we've talked a lot publicly when I was at Irrational about how it sought a lot of iterations. And initially, Bioshock was a game that we were planning on for I was going to say Xbox One, but the initial Xbox, the first one, the original one. And at the time, it was a more traditional like sci-fi shooter, and it was just you arrive on this tropical island where there are Nazis everywhere, and you want to going through all kinds of experimentation and morphing your body into sort of like more of like pulling on genetics from the sea and getting like a crustacean shell and this sort of stuff. And so it was very different. And eventually that was scrapped in favor of going off and working on SWAT 4 and some in Australia's case, Tribe's Vengeance. And so we were working on that, and this pull to create Bioshock, because we all loved System Shock 2, right? Everyone at the company, I think, was an enormous fan, whether they worked on it or not. I didn't work on System Shock 2 myself, but huge fan, and that was part of the reason I came to the company. And so we just really felt like there was a lot left on the playing field with System Shock 2. That was a spectacular game, but it didn't find the audience that we felt it deserved. And so we wanted to rectify that. And so we were looking very carefully as to what held it back, I guess you could say. And I think the biggest things were that it was a little bit, had a lot of barriers to entry, had some pain points. The interface was a little bit kludgy, and there were some innovations there for sure. But it was it's not the kind of broadly accessible game. And so we wanted to create something that could find a much bigger audience, but at the same time hold true to all the mechanics and a lot of the design philosophy to make a game that, again, that was worthy of the Shock license. Of course, it was a spiritual successor, so we didn't actually, it's not System Shock 3, obviously. And so, we worked very carefully to weigh every single feature in System Shock 2 and said, okay, well, do we need this? How can we improve on this? How can we streamline this? How can we make it more meaningful to the player? That was a key pillar for the game for Bioshock, was we always tried to stress meaningful choice. And so whether you're talking about what you're doing with your weapons in every single combat, or what you're talking about how I'm going to upgrade my character and my stat sheet, if you will, right down to the little sisters. It was all about, if I'm going to choose this direction, if I'm going to make this choice, how does that impact things, and how is that meaningful? Because it's very easy in a game to just give the player options, right? It's what's interesting, where it becomes interesting is if you're like looking at those options and being like, I want this, but I need this, and I guess I need this more, so I'm going to go with that. You don't want to, it's not about regret, but it's about making it so that people feel invested in those decisions. So, really looking very closely at all those elements, really looking very closely at, what the strengths of the game were. And I think a big part of it was the storytelling and the narrative and the immersion level that the game had. I think at the time, most shooters were, you just run down a hall, you blast a bunch of demons or monsters or aliens or whatever, and then you move on, you don't care about it. And, to us, that was always, a tragedy. It's a waste, right? You think about games, what's the one thing that games have over any other medium, right? Besides interactivity, it's this notion of being able to pull information out of the environment. And so rather than just hauling ass down some corridor, making the player slowly, creep around and observe every nook and cranny and say, what's around the next corner, but then also like what's in this crate, what's under this couch, what's in the pillow cushions, that kind of thing. And so as we got into it more and more, the game shifted quite a bit, like I said, both from that more focused on strictly a shooter to that happy, I feel like that happy mix of shooter and character growth and environmental storytelling. It wasn't without a lot of iteration and a lot of pain, frankly. It was one of the most rewarding projects I've ever worked on, but it was tough to get right, and so a big part of that was, I think we've talked about it quite a bit, about how we put the game in front of gamers, in front of usability testing, and they would just rip it to shreds, right? They would tear it apart. They said it's like cheap man's Half-Life, give it like 2 out of 10, and they tore it apart. And a lot of that was just the way we were presenting information and the way that we weren't pacing things out correctly, and that people didn't really have that context as to why they were there, and so they were just kind of floundering around, roaming around the space, and not really getting what was making the experience great. And so we took a step back and really focused on how to sell that. It really was about, it's interesting because you go back and you look at the history of the project, you look at all the iterations and where the Little Sisters used to be slugs, and look at how that iterated. And if you look at the re-release, the remastered version, you can see that art museum that's on the disc. I don't know if you saw that, but it's super cool to see a lot of these different iterations, but also like if you look at the monsters, the splicers, they were sort of a lot more monstery before, and they were cool. Some of them not so much. Some of them were pretty terrible. But to sort of really emphasize that human element and step away from the monster, and make them monstrous humans rather than something with a giant weaponized arm, that kind of thing. That's nowhere near as interesting as hearing the sort of psychodrama of the sort of breadwinner character who's roaming around the halls, sort of echoing the greatness of his heyday. The initial plane ride in the bathysphere, that was all primarily driven by Ken and the art team, Nate Wells and Stephen Alexander and Scott Sinclair. And basically as soon as you arrive in Rapture, that was the level that I was focused on for much of development. And that was probably the area, was the first level we started working on, and it was built. Initially, you'll see sequences that are from the initial art space, which is meant to be like, here's a snapshot of what the level will look like. And so that room, the Kashmir restaurant, it was based around that. And so the idea of this welcome center, because we knew that there's a lot of information we had to get across, and you have to slowly onboard people, right? To get people into the systems, get people into the world, get people into the atmosphere, just set the tone correctly. And so any one of those moments tuned improperly or not hitting on the right notes, and the whole thing falls flat. And we found that in testing, that we're missing a piece here, and people are getting lost, and they're frustrated, and they're like, fucking, I'm done, And so you test it a lot, but I think it really came down to constantly looking at a list of like, okay, what do we need to get across in the intro to the game? So the bathysphere ride down, we're getting across the ideals of Rapture, what it's all about. Here's Andrew Ryan, he built this utopia for these reasons and all that sort of thing. And then you arrive and you immediately want to see how that went wrong, right? So you want to show how the idea is sexy, and then show how it can go completely wrong. And so you arrive, and we knew it right off the bat. We wanted to show this is a nut house. This is everything's gone wrong. The idea of when you arrive having the splicer, tear apart your bathysphere so there's no way of no return. You're at the point of no return there then, and then making it so that you're instantly faced off against a really overpowered enemy that you'll meet later on. A lot of people don't necessarily realize this, but this character comes down, beats the shit out of your bathysphere, and then sort of skirts off, and it's out there. So immediately there's this tension, right? And then we knew that we also wanted to introduce, like I said, talking about the system. So we've met Atlas at this point, the bathysphere ride down, you get a little glimpse at him, and then he's going to help you out. And so that creature you just saw at the intro, he's going to scare them off and build up a little trust, right? Then at that point, we do the whole introduce the melee combat, and you have to slowly pace these things out, right? You have to be very careful because I was saying before that at one point, it was a shooter, right? And so you want to be very careful with the audience and make sure we didn't know necessarily how much people would tolerate in terms of stretching things out and building up that tension. And so, at one point, we get some feedback that people are a little bored and they're ready for the next thing. And so at that point, it's like, okay, we can do two things. We can, up the action a little bit and get people into it a little bit more. And so at one point I was playing around with the idea of like, okay, let's give the player a powerful weapon early on. We can either have you run out of ammo or have it break or you lose it or something like that. It's sort of like the Metroid thing, where they give you crazy overpowered weapons and then they take them away. So that can be frustrating in its own way if you don't do it right. So we were playing around with all these ideas. Okay, we'll introduce the plasmids first, introduce the weapons, but we ultimately settled on the wrench so we can slowly build up your powers, your powers, so you feel like more of that arc. And so we did the traditional training thing of like, okay, we're going to block the player in place. You got to pick up the wrench and smash your way through, right? That's what you do with a wrench. Then you come up into the plasmid introduction room, and this was another space that was iterated on a million times. And the sequence initially was going to be, we're going to tease you about the plasmids, you're going to get a plasmid, you're going to become overpowered by it, it's your first time you're writing your genetic code, and you're going to pass out. You're going to fall over this thing, and you're going to pass out, and you're going to wake up, and you're going to get a little tease. It's one of the few times we'll put you in a cutscene. We'll tease you about the world of Little Sisters and Big Daddies, because we'll have you in a captive state, essentially, captive audience. And, basically you'll come to and you'll have your first plasmid, and then you can basically make your way past the sort of Metroid-inspired blockage, right? The whole shock the door to open it up. And so, you sort of feel your way around the constraints of building a level where, like, for example, it's an easy thing to miss in design, but a lot of times when you're creating a level, the tendency is to just give the player a new tool and let them go run wild with it. But this sort of Zelda, Metroid, Nintendo mechanic is to introduce you to a blockage, force you to either backtrack or go off on a sort of offshoot or a spoke, discover a new tool, put that tool to interesting uses, and then use it on that blockage. And so that's what we did in that first space. And again, that moved around, had a million different iterations. And again, space by space, you'll see this every single room is about getting across a very specific idea and making that as clear as possible, making it so that it's entertaining, make it so that has urgency, and that it's fun to play, and that it teaches players what it needs to. Pretty much every tool in the Bioshock world, we tried to make it so that it was grounded in some sort of reality. Like, why would this? You're not going to have chances of you having a sword are a lot less likely than having something that has practical use. And so a wrench is perfect for that, right? If you get leaked, yeah, exactly, yeah. So that was something we actually frequently went back to, is like, what does this tool say about the world? And so when you're taking the bathysphere down to Rapture, the advertisement you see is for Incinerate, right? And it's a woman lighting a match, her fingers, for her husband's cigarette, or a man's cigarette. And so, some of the powers and things like that, they're totally goofy. They wouldn't make any sense. But, Ken, the narrative team, all of us, we figured a way to make it so that that stuff sells, so that stuff makes sense and feels grounded. And I think that's one of the big differences between Bioshock and a lot of other games, is the believability. You look at the architecture, you look at the way it's structured. If you really looked at it, it'd be ridiculous, but it's just enough to sell it. And it's the same thing with the genetics, right? You're rewriting your genetic code. We had a geneticist or whatever, a scientist come in, and we asked her a bunch of questions about how genetics works, and asked, would it be possible to theoretically splice your genes to set something on fire, all these ridiculous questions that we were doing. And she's like, well, that's not really how science works, but you find a way to position it such that it would pass that smell test. And that was how pretty much everything went down. Ken was always the arbiter of every single idea. he's like a goalkeeper in a lot of ways, right? You have an idea and you'd be like, hey, what do you think about this? And he'd be like, no, get that shit out of here. Or he'd be like, oh, what about if we did it this way? Or, and iterate on it. And I think that definitely percolated down to the rest of the team as well. Everyone was constantly looking at every single idea and saying, you put it up against the pillars of like I said, the meaningful choice. There's meaningful choice in whether or not I want to brain someone with my wrench, right? Because that feels terrible. You feel it's a moral conundrum. Yeah, but so you look very carefully at every decision you're making and weigh it against those pillars.
On. Daddy.
We tease it several times, and that's important. I think that, to get that, feeling right, you can't just sort of throw the player in it. And so that's why you have that little dream cutscene sequence where you're sort of coming to, and you see the little sister come in trying to collect Adam from you. And then you kind of see little glimpses of little sister and Big Daddy walking around a couple of times. But then ultimately the scene where you come into the theater and you see the little sister down below and she's gathering from that corpse. That was also probably one of the most iterated scenes in the game. And, originally it was just like, oh, there's a big fire here because we want to draw attention to this scene. And so there's a little sister there and there's a Big Daddy standing over in the corner doing his Big Daddy thing. And you sort of skirting your way around, but we didn't really fully sell what was going on, or and so, but it was also we didn't really have the best control as to what the player was going to be doing, and so one of the things I did with that scene was I turned it into a theater because you think about presentation, you think about the way a theater is set up and the way that you're walking on the scaffolding. It seemed like a natural fit. To present the player with where they're looking with the spotlight right on it, and it's complete artifice, right? But it works. I think it's enough to you're using the real world to nudge players in the right way, and so we played around a bunch with the right configuration in there and the lighting and the way that's all presented. And at one point, I made it so that you're walking on that scaffolding. Originally, you were walking around the outside, and that wasn't enough. You needed to see the little sister doing her thing. And it's really tough if you're in the same room with someone, people don't want to, gamers don't want to cooperate. I don't know what percent, but some overwhelming majority is going to get right up in your actor's face and start smashing it and smashing the walls and looking the other way. But that was important for us to make it so that it felt organic and it was in the world and it wasn't a cutscene. When we went to cutscene a couple of times and it was always motivated by something. That was a rule that we had, that it had to be, there had to have been a reason why we take control from the player, because that's what the game's all about, right? And so I made the move to make it so that you're walking on the scaffolding and you can see down directly through it, and your position, because everything else is dark, so you're naturally drawn to that. It's the only sound, only movement, only part that's lit. And then at one point, I think it was Steven Alexander, but basically added a sort of U shape to that light, which sometimes you see lighting fixtures set up that way in stages. But that even further helped you get more time. It prolonged the path, but it also made it so you're walking directly at her. And these little subtle changes are what make the difference. And you could see where, again, you started off where you're walking around on the balcony, and people don't want to turn and watch. They're not going to strafe and pay close attention to the thing that you want them to look at. So you move to the scaffolding, and then you change the scaffolding, you change the lighting, and then and so, there's, like I said, countless hours of iteration there, and then you make your way downstairs, and you find ways to block you in, right? There's that accordion gate there. And we, for the longest time, people would, like I was saying before, they don't want to cooperate. So they take the wrench and they just smash the lock and they run away and they try and get in the room with the little sister, and so that was actually a really tricky thing to get right. And we totally forgot that we had this "would you kindly" notion, right? Spoiler alert. It's 10 years later. It's cool. So, when we first come into that room, Atlas says, would you kindly lower that weapon for a second? Because we struggled with, when to introduce the, ranged weapons and plasmas and all that sort of stuff. And so we had this contrivance that we could just say, oh, forget it, lower your weapon, you're not going to be able to smash your way out of this. And I personally went down a million rabbit holes there to try and contain the player before we eventually did the lower the weapon thing. You'll see in that sequence that there's a busted vending machine there. And that was because originally what was going to happen was that the Big Daddy smashes that splicer through the window, and then you get the pistol from him. And then you use the pistol to shoot off the lock. You couldn't use the wrench originally. So you shoot the lock off, but I'm sure you can see where this becomes a problem, right? People could run out of ammo. So if you shoot, you miss your shot, or you decide to shoot at the sky or whatever, do some kind of whatever cowboy dance. The vending machine would go, make its broken sound, and that's Ken's voice, by the way, the Circus of Values. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah, funny story.
Kill your cravings at the Circus of Values.
So you would hear it activate and would spoot out a bunch of bullets, and if you keep shooting, then you'll spit out some more, or whatever. That took a lot of work to sell it, but also to make functional. And then people were like, well, yeah, I kind of expect to be able to smash this with a wrench, and that should work. I was like, no, a wrench isn't as powerful as a gun. And there was a big fight on the team. It's like, well, yeah, but we're trying to always say yes to the player. That was the thing that we always said, is like, if it feels like it's something I should be able to do, let's try and make good on that. So there was a lot of fighting about that, but ultimately it didn't matter, because lowered that weapon, and we're going to smash it with a wrench. And so yeah, development is often about, especially in level design, there's a lot of wasted work. There's a lot of time you spend, going down rabbit holes that don't matter because of some design change that comes late, or because you test it out and you realize that people hate it, or it's just not reading, or there's a better way to do it. That's also kind of the fun. I don't remember the number of check-ins that were done on that particular map, but it was easily hundreds and hundreds. And so, each of those check-ins is you're getting feedback from Ken and the team, and the other designers, and you're getting it from other departments. They're sitting down playing and say, I was playing this sequence, and it kind of, maybe you should try doing it in this way. And we just got this brand new feature. This new plasmid came online, and so then you go back and you have to sort of iterate combats based on that. So I don't have a number. I sort of wish I still had access to Perforce, just so I could see the number of check-ins. But yeah, I mean, it's you don't really think about it while you're doing it. You're kind of always sort of on the chase. You're always like, oh, this is it. This is going to do the thing. And I think if you realize that it's going to be wrong as much and for as long as it is, that you'd probably want to crawl into your desk and just like wait 6 months or a year until things settled. But that's exactly it. That's what design is. It's about getting involved in the fray and finding the right solutions, helping tease out those answers. And so a lot of times it's, Ken will have finally recorded the voiceover, and you get that in, and you realize that the pacing still sucks in ways you hadn't anticipated, because you pace things out in your head and you put in text to speech in the level and that sort of thing. And then when you get the actual actors in, you realize, okay, well, I gotta change this up, and it changes the tone and changes the mood and the pacing. And so yeah, it's just really about, but it's also learning lessons along the way. So it's not all like, oh, I'm throwing that out and it's completely gone. Because in a lot of cases you go back to like, hey, remember when we did that thing and we thought it was terrible, but maybe we should go back to that because things have changed enough that it may feel a lot different. So you kind of become this encyclopedia of, or this sort of historian of your level. And while you shouldn't cling to those things, you should always sort of be aware of what decisions you made and why, so that because you'll frequently get the same suggestions over and over again. It's like, we tried that, and here's why it didn't work, so you don't wind up going down that same dead end or wasting time. But yeah, it's as exhilarating as it is frustrating.
Don't you disrespect me! We can see you, you know.
It's funny because when we went and built Bioshock Infinite, that intro, and we weren't quite hitting the mark in development with it, trying to look at, okay, what did we do right in Bioshock 1 in the intro? And, from my perspective, I kind of boiled it down and spent a whole lot of time looking at comments from gamers and reviews and talking to members of the team and all that sort of thing. And the way I boiled it down is because I felt like it had three major elements. It had mystery, It had urgency and it had awe, and it had the mystery and like there's so many questions right off the bat, and it's we found in development that if you have too many questions or there's not enough information, people become frustrated and they're like, you know what, I'm done. They tune out and they just kind of start smashing stuff with their wrench. So you have to find the right amount of information to reveal. So mystery was important. The urgency, I'm a plane crash survivor, and I come down and I'm like in this city it seems like it's in the middle of this war or it's completely fallen apart, and somebody smashes up the bathysphere like I was talking about before. So it's no turning back, and I need to find out what's going on here, but I need to get the hell out at the same time. So there's urgency, at every turn. Like every room, there's a new sense of upping the ante, and then also that sense of awe. You like from the very beginning, that plane crash and the fire and the water and the amazing effects that that Steven created, and then the lighthouse when you first see it, and then that descent down into the city. The awe comes from you haven't seen these things before. This is completely a complete novel mishmash of elements. That the city at the bottom of the sea is going to be fascinating to any extent, but I think one of the things that really helped it stand out was you've never seen that aesthetic at the bottom of the sea. You think about, underwater cities, and you think submarines, and you think, metal, you think steel, you think, stone is pretty porous, and that was actually something we built initially. Our first pass at Rapture was a lot more industrial feeling, and frankly, it was a little boring. And I think the team felt that, and that's how we came to the Art Deco look. Ken came back to work one day after one of his very few vacations. He went to New York City and went to Rockefeller Plaza and came back with all these pictures of these grand, buildings and skyscrapers, and just the sort of simplicity of the buildings, but the boldness as well. That was something that you don't see, even though it's very video gamey. You look at the look it's of Art Deco, and it's very much focused on the high level details, the silhouettes, just the boldness. And so, when Ken honed in on that and the art team started to build that out, as soon as you got it in the game, you're like, it just popped, And so I think so much of the success was about that, finding these unique elements that on their own are really cool, but maybe have been done before, and then you mash them together. It's the same thing that, you look at Star Wars, right? It's a sci-fi opera, right? You look at the fact that it uses classical music. Where traditionally that would always use the Buck Rogers type sci-fi sounding stuff. We know what sci-fi sounds like music-wise, right? And so when you have opportunity to introduce new elements and mix them together, that always, because people always want the same but different, right? That's something that they always say in entertainment, and that was something we looked at very carefully with Bioshock Infinite. It's pretty much a lot of the same ideas, same philosophies, same. Both from a design perspective, but also from an art perspective. It's you're instead of an isolated city at the bottom of the sea, it's up in the clouds, and so it feels very familiar, but it's different enough that it gets people excited. I mean, I'm very proud of it. I mean, like the team, I think we really did an amazing job. But there's always lots of little things. For me, I think. Most of my things I would want to see change would be mechanical changes. I would, the way the Vita chambers worked, it's tough to complain because, it found a great audience and it was incredibly well received, and I'm honored. But, I do wish that we could have maintained a little bit more of that tension when you die. So right, I was always pushing for it. The Vita chambers are directly ripped out of System Shock 2. And I always loved that system. And when we were talking about, how to handle, death in Bioshock, I said, like, let's just do what System Shock 2 did, because it kept you right in the action, right? And so we kept that part, and we had the notion of deducting money or having some kind of penalty to dying, but we ultimately tweaked that such that it didn't cost anything, and we lost a little bit of the sting, and we got a lot of praise for that, because it was, the game's not about the combat challenge, right? It's not Dark Souls, but it again, it's about meaningful choice, and obviously you don't choose to die, but when you do die with no sting to that, that does make some of the choices a little less meaningful when you go to a vending machine and you're firing every single bullet. It would make it a lot more impactful. So I don't regret it, but I do wish we had more time to revisit that. It was an issue that came up quite a bit in development. So the Vita chambers, the way those worked, I think I also probably would have liked to see. Let me think about this for a second. Jeez. I'm not that happy with the way the very end of the level turned out, like the threat of the splicers coming in when Ryan sicks them on you. There's a lot of artifice there, and that we never really were able to get it to a level that felt like, here's Ryan, he's an incredible threat, and he's in control of the splicers, right? And the splicers, you don't want to fuck with the splicers. We didn't get that across. I felt like, I love the way we ended up with Ryan, the way he was presented, that sort of monolithic 1984 presentation. But then we say, oh, the splicers are coming, and there's a couple that come and pound on the doors, pound on the glass. But I feel like it's a little flat there. I would have liked to be able to focus more on making that feel more impactful and more vicious, more of a threat. I think we wanted to keep it so that the Big Daddies and Little Sisters were their own thing, and you hadn't fought them up into that point. I think that they had their place. You just were introduced to the ecology of the Little Sisters and the Big Daddy, and we knew that later on we wanted to actually, once you've geared up enough, once you've had enough time to familiarize yourself with the combat, but also the systems, get a couple more plasmids. Then there's that moment where Atlas says, "You're ready now." You take on a Big Daddy and Little Sister. So I feel like that might have been premature. Certainly you could have had it sort of threaten you, but I think that, again, the idea was that Ryan was in control of the splicers, and that the Big Daddies and Little Sisters were kind of impenetrable. Nobody really controlled them. They were programmed to do something. They're created to do something, and they continue to do that regardless of what goes on in the city. And that's actually part of the interesting commentary there, is that, like, the entire city fell apart in a lot of ways because of the Big Daddies and Little Sisters and what that brought to the city. That would give people the powers that they always, desired, to sort of take their ideals, their practice, whether it's Steinman or Senator Cohen, and take it to the extreme. So the city fell apart, starts crumbling, starts getting flooded, people start murdering each other, they start losing their minds, and the Big Daddies and Little Sisters, they remain a constant, keep doing their same thing over and over again, roaming the halls, collecting, working together. So I don't think we wanted to mess with that. It's funny because, you talk to developers, you talk to designers, and they all have different approaches to solving the problems and to implementing the content in their levels. And, I think that you have to worry very carefully what your own strengths are and what the goals are of the project and how the team works. And so I think one of the successes we had on Bioshock in the level creation was that it was very fluid. I think that we knew that we had a bunch of different processes that we could try out, and we were willing to admit when it wasn't working and shift things around. So sometimes we'd bounce people around from level to level. Sometimes we would say, this level's just not working, let's throw it out. And some of the levels that I worked on, they saw a lot of iteration. There were some of the levels that we built first, again, the first level and then Fort Frolic. And even though they went through all kinds of different changes, the core of them stayed the same. Like, for example, in Fort Frolic, originally the idea back when the game was, again, sort of the in-between state where I was talking about before about the industrial feeling rapture. This was long after the Nazi thing, but this is like basically the city is dilapidated. There was no Art Deco, and it was just more industrial. And back when the Little Sisters were slugs, So Fort Frolic was about, the mall like it is right now, but we had these, every single deck, if you will, every single section of the city were controlled by these things called savants. And they were essentially brains in jars, right? We had like Themis and Prometheus, and they would basically control different aspects of every single level. And so I knew that we had this research mechanic. We had this, you could go around and take pictures. And I wanted to leverage that. I wanted to take the mechanic and turn it into something that you could build a level around. And so there was always something else that was keeping it from getting it where it needed to be. And so I think there was this constant drive to get it right. And like I said, it's that carrot on a stick thing. It's like, if I just change this thing, if I just change this thing. And I think, that was exactly how Irrational worked, was like, it's not quite right. I got to get it right, got to get it right. And so I certainly felt that drive. And I know everyone else I worked with on all my levels felt that way as well. In terms of how it felt ready, that first focus test we did and people tore it apart, that obviously, I went into that thinking it's pretty close. I knew about the bugs. I knew that we had to guide people better and that there was some polish that was needed. But, it was a wake-up call, and that people like slammed it. And so we all went back and we just started iterating some more. And then you started to get the whiff of it being close when we started to do regular focus tests. The team in 2K would bring in regular testers, and they'd do full playthroughs, and they would be giving their feedback, and they'd have an observer there writing down where people get stuck and where they get frustrated and that sort of thing. And you watch the lists that they would generate, and watch it sort of dwindle and get more and more focused, and you'd be left with like a few dozen issues. They were like, yeah, we know about that. We're going to fix that in this way. We're not going to address that because that's meant to be a mystery, that kind of thing. And so you could feel it getting really, really close. And then I would say, about a month or so before ship, you come into the office one day and enough content had been updated. You sit down and you play it, and you realize, like, holy, this feels amazing. And you start to bring in friends and family to test, and they're through the roof with it. And we basically started to put together that first demo that essentially broke Xbox Live when we released it. It's funny, up until that point, we had no idea how it was going to do. We still had quite a bit of press coverage and support, and it seemed like there was a growing fan base, a lot of interest in that sort of thing, but you don't know how it's going to translate. So there was this. For me, I was terrified. Like, I believed in what we built, but I didn't know that it was going to find an audience. I was terrified that it was going to be too weird, and that there was going to be another, Irrational game that critical darling, but didn't break through. And I think the first sign we had was that day when we released the demo. It was about a month before we came out. And we came in that morning, and it had released at like 9, so we all moseyed in at like 10 or 11, and people were like, did you try and download the demo? I was like, yeah, I couldn't get on Xbox Live, and I was like, oh, okay, that's weird. So we all, like, a bunch of us went to the playroom, and we started to try and download it, and it was just kind of like snail's pace. And at the time, Xbox Live was a really sturdy service, but, it never really kind of had that mass, like, because this is before Halo 3 came out, and so there was no Call of Duty. It was Call of Duty, but like it was 1 and 2, and then you think about Modern Warfare.
Modern Warfare came out in 2007.
It did. So it was like 2 months later, I believe, and that was. This is why we were terrified. 2007 was, I think, the best year in gaming. You had Assassin's Creed, you had Mass Effect, you had Mario Galaxy, you had Halo 3, you had Call of Duty Modern Warfare, you had Bioshock. It's like, and we're looking at all these titles and be like, oh my God, we're f***ed. Like, there's no way. Like. But again, we had the press on our side, thankfully. And that morning we came and we're like, I think we might be okay. We might be okay. Because someone had a contact at Microsoft and be like, yeah, we think you guys broke Xbox Live. This is unconfirmed, but the demo came up. We all experienced it. We had friends across the industry who were saying it. And so it was pretty cool. It was one of the most rewarding experiences working on Bioshock, but it was also, the amount of work. We worked our asses off on it. We crunched for sure, but I think the thing that made it obviously the end result made it worth it, but the fact that we felt like we were working on something special, and we could see it, and you see the snippets of the art coming in, you hear the voice actors coming in, and you start to see some level sequences come, like and every day it's something new, and you go to Perforce and you sync up and you see the new content coming in, and there's nothing better, seeing that progress. But I think that was the moment where we were like, we all kind of breathed, like, oh, finally. Yeah, and then it did pretty well.
Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me, my lover stands on gold.